morning. Hi, everyone. My name is Ralph Al-Haddad. I'm the Regional Head of Integrity at SNC-Lavalin. I want to welcome you at this panel discussion on FCPA and its success in combating corruption outside of the US. So our panelists are a group of experts in ethics and compliance and are based in different regions of the world. So without further ado, I will start the discussion by introducing briefly our panelists and by asking them questions with follow-up discussions. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to send them in the chat. So first of all, we have Pat Poitvin, based in Canada. He's the co-founder and managing director at the Canadian Centre of Excellence for Anti-Corruption. We have Irvlin Young, based in Indonesia, who's a partner at Pathway Peers. We have Silvia Vig, who's the CEO of Kodupo Compliance in Croatia. And last but not least, we have George Wren, who's managing director at Exeger in the US. So my first question will be addressed to Pat. Pat, can you tell us how has the FCPA and other anti-corruption regulatory frameworks influenced business practices? And what do you think companies need to know about their exposure to corruption risk?
Well, thanks for the question, Ralph, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, sharing the stage with these great panelists. You know, it's a really important question. Where you look at the FCPA and the influence around the world, nobody can debate the influence of the U.S. economy and the dominance of the U.S. economy, and of course the use of dollars, U.S. dollars in terms of transaction around the world. And really, the FCPA has been the benchmark in terms of anti-corruption regulation around the world. Its influence, the UN and the CD Convention, it has influence around the world. It has an evolutionary process, but really it is the benchmark that a lot of companies around the world are using. A lot of countries also have used the FCPA to build their own regulatory framework. And the impact of it in terms of globally, the extraterritoriality of the FCPA, the reach of the FCPA has had impact around the world. And if you look at the major cases, the top 10 cases of FCPA, apart from Goldman Sachs at $3.3 billion in terms of penalties, all the other companies are non-US entities. So it has huge impact in terms of business around the world, where it has influenced how business is conducted. Because, the FCPA was about obviously reducing the impact of corruption and is creating a level playing field. But really, it has had an impact in how business is conducted, because it's requiring greater accountability, greater transparency, and to address the extreme impact in social development, economic development in all countries, developing countries in particular. So it has had a huge influence in terms of how business is conducted for improving their capacity to deal more effectively with corruption. So where the sanctions have increased, but also the accountability and responsibility of senior managers and boards in terms of taking things seriously when it comes to corruption, because it's no longer just, the requirement is no longer just a piece of paper and having a policy, but it needs to demonstrate it's working, it's effective, it's tested, so that anti-corruption compliance measures can be demonstrated to be effective, so it can reduce that impact.
Right. Thank you so much, Pat. And to build up on what you're saying, I have a question for Silvia. Silvia, from your perspective, are there any obstacles for multinational companies in implementing FCPA requirements at local levels?
Yes. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. And before answering the question, I would like to agree with that, because I really think that FCPA is one of the most powerful and effective transnational anti-corruption law in the world. And it really has a great impact on markets, especially in those emerging ones where no local anti-corruption law exists, for example, in markets where I operate. And in fact, I can say that in such a market is the only law that forces some local organizations, for example, distributors, suppliers, or consultants, to comply with the world standard in fighting against corruption. But today I would like to present and share my perspective and my experience working with local organizations that work with multinational companies in countries where I operate, in Croatia and in the region, in former Yugoslavia countries. And in my work, I have identified 5 obstacles that maybe affect compliance with FCPA requirements, and perhaps multinational companies should take them into account when they make a decision where the engagement should take place. The first obstacle is the cultural heritage. And I think that in addition to the Transparency International CPI index, it is necessary to take into account the cultural aspect of each country, especially collectivist countries, which are generally more susceptible to corruption compared to individualistic ones, and where it is culturally common to favor members of your own group. And we call that nepotism and clientelism, and quite often jobs are not given according to qualifications, but according to connection, be it family or friend. And while individualistic countries prefer universal ethical standards in a process of decision making, for example, like categorical imperative and similar, which is based on common good and some universal ethical values such as honesty, justice, fairness, and responsibility. But on the other side, collectivist societies take more utilitarian approach, seeking to generate the greatest good, but not for the greatest number of people, but for in-group members. And I think that when multinational companies enter those markets, they have to educate local organizations. They have to organize training courses in conflict of interest and help them in developing and writing conflict of interest policies, because, as I said, we have a problem recognizing conflict of interest culturally. The second obstacle is unfamiliarity with all FCPA terms. For example, the definition of government officials in the FCPA is much broader than, for example, defined by certain national laws in local markets. For example, local laws on our market do not apply to members and candidates of political parties, or maybe members of the military and family members of all those persons and other persons that I didn't mention, but they are also covered by FCPA. For example, professors at state-owned universities, and therefore local organization must also consider these individuals, not just those prescribed by local laws of government officials. And if we have a person who is a government official, it doesn't mean that we want to do business with them. It just means that we have to make an additional assessment just to check if maybe some possible indirect bribery or some conflict of interest is in relation to that person. The third obstacle that I have noticed is that many local organizations think that they are doing business more ethically than they really are. They overestimate their ethicality and often have a holier than thou attitude. They announce their ethical values on website, but in fact do not base their business on them at all. They take care if something is in accordance with the law, but satisfying minimal legal standards or regulation requirements. But I'm not sure how often they take into consideration reputational risk and how their activities are complied with ethical values. The fourth obstacle is inadequate local codes of ethics. In my practice, I have noticed that codes of ethics are usually written too generally. They usually do not have clearly defined and developed policies of gifts, hospitality, conflict of interest, and donations. And if those items are not clearly prescribed, we cannot expect employees to behave ethically, because we can't calibrate their ethical behaviors with some ethical standards. And I often find, for example, in codes that employees are allowed to receive the gift of symbolic value. But symbolic value for one person can be $10 and for another person could be $500. And therefore, for example, if values and the frequency of receiving gifts are not prescribed in the code of ethics, or maybe if donation policy is not clearly defined, that is already a red flag or an obstacle for us. But we have to take in mind that code of ethics is very important because it is often the foundation upon which an effective compliance or anti-corruption program is based. And the fifth obstacle, and maybe the most important one, is the inception of corruption. I need to emphasize, and we need to take that into account, that corruption doesn't appear in the process of public procurement tender, which in the local markets, for example, could be highly regulated and in accordance with European regulations, like in our market, in my country. But the problem is that corruption occurs earlier in the phase of defining the tender specifications, and this step is difficult to regulate. And for example, the local supplier can have an anti-corruption policy, but who can prevent the owner not participating in setting the tender specification to their advantage? Because if he doesn't do that, there are maybe 10 other companies that will, or also probably give a bribe. Therefore, a local organization, in addition to anti-corruption policy, has to implement financial and non-financial control in place. And I think that ISO 37001 can really help them in that. But also they have to insist on ton on the top and ton in the middle based on integrity, which are key indicators of the successful anti-corruption program, and only possible prevention of rigging and corruption at that early phase.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think these are very excellent points, and it's always interesting from an international perspective to try and understand what companies implement at local levels, because it differs from one region to the other. So thank you. That's very interesting. My next question is to Ren. So George, I wanted to ask you, so 2021 represented the lowest FCPA enforcement year since 2015. Do you think this represents the beginning of a potential slowdown in enforcement in the US, or does this have any global implications for foreign bribery enforcement?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ralph, and thanks the other panelists. And really, the last couple of words by Sylvia and Patrice are spot on. I think it's important to realize historically, when you think about the numbers, that a dip in enforcement, even as significant as this dip is, do not read into it. When I was at the FBI before joining Exeger, for the last 4.5 years of my career, I led the FCPA work for the Department of Justice, FBI International Corruption Unit, and worked closely with the DOJ, SEC, and components around the world on FCPA enforcement. In fact, the reason I'm on this panel is because I worked with Pat when he was at the RCMP and I was at the FBI coordinating intelligence and evidence for FCPA cases. The thing to keep in mind is these cases are incredibly long. And so typically 3-4 years in the United States, maybe even longer. There's examples of much longer cases. Globally, 6-7 years in length. And so just because there's an off year, don't think that there's actually a slowdown in enforcement. We don't know how big the pipeline is, both in the DOJ and globally, right? To the comments earlier by the other panelists about what's happening around the globe. Remember, information is being shared, evidence is being shared across multiple jurisdictions. These things do take time. There's no question that the COVID pandemic has slowed elements of investigations and prosecutions. It does not mean the cases go away, right? Maybe interviews take longer to get done, or they have to wait until the parts of certain countries open up. Sometimes grand juries are not convened as quickly as they would like. Those are slowdowns, but those are not stoppages or points of the case that just stop. They just wait and they'll do those later, or they'll find other ways to collect that evidence and get that information. Also, I think it's important to look at the administration. Lisa Monaco of the Department of Justice has made numerous comments now about enforcement action of the FCPA, monitorships, there's no question that this administration and the department are very committed to enforcement. And we can expect that I would think, through the rest of the administration. And really, historically, we haven't really seen a real downturn in enforcement of FCPA because the cases are will go long within administrations, tend to be sometimes. And so that's because there's an outlier of enforcement. That's exactly what it is. I don't know what the pipeline is, but I would guess that it's very healthy. And in all my time at the Bureau and in watching from the sidelines when I got out of the government, there's so many good things happening with the sharing of information. And then when you read indictments and you read statement of facts, you realize that cases are using more and more capabilities globally, and that this is not going away. Groups like the OECD are bringing better capabilities around the world to better partners and to really enhance the ability to bring these cases to justice, not just in the United States. But don't be a fool and think, oh, the FCPA is going away, the numbers are down. I think you can expect those numbers to go back up. And ultimately, when you think about your job as either a chief compliance officer or someone's, the defense side of these things, even if there is a little bit of down year, your job and your responsibilities and your focus doesn't really change if there's maybe a blip on the radar. We all know that, despite a down year, it doesn't change the mission of everybody's important jobs here at the conference. And so that's my perspective on it. And I think, I would say there's more to come. I don't know what next year brings, this year 2022, but I guarantee that no one's letting off on the gas pedal, either within the DOJ and SEC and around the globe. Thanks.
Thanks, George. I certainly agree with you. I don't think the FCPA is going anywhere, and I think the trend is that there's even more enforcement around the world from other legislation as well, and in other countries. So to get a perspective from the Asia Pacific region, I would like to ask Irvlin, from your perspective, Irvlin, what are the top challenges in fighting corruption, and what are the challenges to effectively implement FCPA?
If we look at the 2021 Corruption Perception Index released by the Transparency International that scores countries from 0, which is highly corrupt, to 100, which is very clean, we could see that 70% of the countries in East and Southeast Asia have sat firmly below 50 over the past decade. What does this number mean? It means that this region still chokes on corruption. Without any doubt, I agree with Ralph, with all of you here, that FCPA has taken the lead in the world war against corruption. It has inspired, has successfully bred more and more anti-corruption laws in multiple jurisdictions and raised the global awareness on compliance. However, the problem of corruption in Southeast Asia is not easy. It is like what Sylvia said. It's a matter of culture. It is deeply embedded in the genes of local culture. FCPA and other anti-bribery laws together, which I would refer to it collectively as law enforcement, is just a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So when FCPA or law enforcement is fighting a lone battle, in the absence of other strategies, in the absence of other pieces of the jigsaw, then it might not make a real difference. Imagine adults bribing cops to get out of traffic tickets, bribing security guards to get a parking space which is reserved for other people, bribing doctors to speed up the COVID-19 vaccine appointment, bribing teachers to get the leaked exam papers before examination. Imagine someone wearing fake Nike shoes, fake Supreme clothes, with a fake Gucci, goes out and buy fake ID, fake CV, fake degree, and apply for a job as a fake news editor. In a corruption riddled, in a society riddled with corruption, this kind of petty forms of bribery is everywhere and anywhere in our daily lives. It's way more than just a business wrongdoing, and many children pathetically grow up believing that giving and taking bribes, it's something which is just fine, which is obviously not okay. So when the root of corruption is deeply anchored in the mindset of the majority, like DNA in the genes, then rooting out corruption would be as difficult as, or even more difficult than genetic engineering. I'm saying that FCPA or law enforcement alone doesn't solve the problem. This is why I'm saying that law enforcement alone does not solve the problem. It really requires like all citizens with grim determination to be involved in the grand cause of reining in corruption, in hatching the right mindset against bribery in the next generation, among the next generation, and finally remove corruption or bribery from the gene of the culture. There is no quick fix, I'm sorry to say that, and there's no quick fix, and FCPA is no wonder drug. However, I believe that there is a strategy to improve the impact of FCPA, or to make more gains out of FCPA. I call this strategy the carrot and stick strategy. And I believe that for this approach, we have done quite a lot on the stick end, and nothing, and not enough is done on the carrot end. Let me give you an example. So I have two friends who work in the very same industry in the same city, in two different companies. The two companies are both highly profitable, and the person working for company A earns 3 to 4 times as much as the person working for company B. The person working for company A can afford a 60 square meter apartment for herself, and another person working for company B must share his apartment, his 60 square meter apartment, with his parents, his spouse, and a child. Then my question is, if somebody offers bribes to these two people, which one is more likely to take the bribe? I guess obviously the answer is the one who is underpaid and sometimes overwork, because I believe that in places where government officials, civil servants, and corporate employees are underpaid and overworked, as we can see in many places in Asia Pacific, corruption thrives. Individual prosperity to some extent can climb down or can overcome the lust for illegal wealth. Take Singapore as an example. Singapore pays high salaries to its government officials to avoid corruption. And in the past 10 years, Singapore has been ranked by Transparency International as one of the world top 5 corruption-free countries in the world. Isn't it amazing? So I argue that carrot is as important as stick in order to beat corruption. And carrot can come in various forms, including good employee benefits. And on the macro level, it should be the amiable political or economic environment that boosts prosperity. And FCPA, cutting-edge technologies that trace down bribery, etc., belongs to the stick part. With this carrot and stick strategy, I hope that FCPA would have more impact in the Asia Pacific region. Over to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Erlyn. I certainly can vouch for the cultural aspect, as well as the aspect what you're saying on poverty. I grew up in the Middle East, and I can certainly say that it's the same case in the Middle East, where corruption is much more it's widely accepted culturally, and I think poverty also has a big role to play in that. And I also want to ask all the other panelists if you want to jump in and give your thoughts on anything that has been said. Please go ahead. And the next question will go to Pat. So Pat,
can I just comment before you ask the question?
Yes, of course.
Because everybody has raised really important points, and I'd like to put a little context to it, where Ren mentioned the enforcement aspect, and you put this in context that now there's greater global cooperation between law enforcement agencies. So it's not just the US or Canada, UK, it's really international cooperation, collaboration, where we not just exchange information, but work in concert with each other. And in today's social media environment, it's not just the fear of being prosecuted that companies need to be aware of. It's the fact that social media and the advent of the Gen Z and the younger generation are more apt to use social media as a platform to speak out against corruption if their corporation is unethical, if they're involved in unethical behavior, in corruption. You're more likely to have people speak out on it in social media. And it's the fear, they should fear just the reputational risk, not just the enforcement aspect, the reputational risk that comes to, listen, I work with a unethical behavior. If you look at Activision, if you look at many of the scandals out there, it's not just the regulatory framework, it is the reputational, because now there's a greater demand for accountability and transparency and being ethical. It's just good business practice. But to speak on Evelyn's part, you need to have cultural intelligence, because the laws are about supply side. It's sanctioned about supply side. Now the demand side you need to act on, but if multinationals are not aware that in their division they employ local people that are working in an environment and a culture where corruption is endemic, it's fine to have policies, thou shalt not pay a bribe. But if they pay bribes themselves to get their driver's license and electricity and everything else, you need to be aware. And what tools are you providing them? What education and training are you providing them? Corruption today is not just about paying money. I mean, the Biden administration has identified corruption as a national security issue, which it is all over the world. So you need to be more proactive in dealing with this and not just looking at supply side, but the demand side. How are you balancing your approach to it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'm
I
sure
want to
Ralph,
ask
just
what are the biggest lessons and takeaways from major FCPA cases that business leaders need to know about? But I think in your answer, you started to touch on some points. But do you have anything else to add with respect to that?
I do, but I think Ren wanted to say something.
just very two quick things. Number one, there's no question there's a culture shift. It's really kind of refreshing with the younger folks coming on board. They really care about who they work for. They don't care about so much about how much they're getting paid. They want to know that ethically they're aligned and work for a company they believe in. This is really an incredible opportunity to help all the amazing people that work so hard to ensure that culture is real. So this is a good thing. Number two, Evelyn hit on it very briefly. You have to start also thinking about technology when you think about taking on some of the major issues with foreign bribery. We always talk about the tone at the top, right? And I know Sylvia talked about that, and those things that we know, but taking on big data, using the data you have available, and using the tools out there, whether it's open source tools or understanding who your people are internally, who your third parties are externally, critically important, and understanding really the data you have. Your companies, your organizations are collecting more data than ever. There's truth in that data, and if you can normalize it, bring it together, that can really make your program efficient and impactful in ways you cannot imagine. And if you read through the latest, iteration of the evaluation of corporate compliance by the department, they do talk about reviewing and analyzing data. And so, in your moving forward on these things, one of the things you need to think about is, how do you bring on a computer scientist into your group? Do you want to bring on maybe some PhDs that are computer scientists that could be free, and do a co-op at your company and give you some capabilities around that? So anyways, bringing that all together, just data, just technology is not going to solve your problem. It's a tool, right? But I just want to highlight the importance of that. So back over to you, Pat, but thanks.
Thank you. Ladies, if you have anything to add before I answer the question. No? Okay. Well, for me, and thank you again for the question, Ralph. I mean, what lessons learned. There's many lessons. We can talk for 8 hours on the lessons learned, but I think it's important to focus on the main key issues here. And it is the fact that most organizations today, they need to be aware that they can't just see that they have a compliance program in place. You know, a piece of paper, words on a piece of paper are worthless if the culture of the organization is toxic, because you can have the best program on paper, but if the focus is on making those numbers, those quarterly numbers by any means, this is the message that you're going to send to your employees, to everybody in the organization. And if you look at the scandals or all the major failures that have occurred, all the major cases, whether United States, FCPA, or any others, it is a failure of leadership, a failure of accountability, and a failure of senior managers to ensure that their program is actually working. Are they testing it? Are the people trained? Do they have the tools to do it? Because if you look at what is important, it's not just having policy procedures. Is tested, are they actually working? What are the metrics are you using? What are the KPIs? And as Ren mentioned, what data analytics are you using to ensure that you are not just looking after the fact? How do you prevent it? How do you mitigate it from happening in the first place? And what type of training are you providing to your people? Because if you look at the major failures that occurred, is first a lack of leadership where there's no accountability. The people at the top, some of them don't have the wherewithal, the knowledge of compliance and ethics and anti-corruption measures to ask the right question of senior management is, what are your metrics? How can you demonstrate to me that things are working? So you need to, first of all, to have the right systems in place to ensure that it is working. You can demonstrate it not just to regulators, but to your employees. How are you communicating the message? What type of culture are you building? Because if you're just pushing the numbers, meeting those numbers that are many times unrealistic, you're giving opportunities and carte blanche for the unethical people to circumvent the controls and the policies that are in place. Because let's be clear, there's not one compliance program on the planet that will ensure 100% that you'll be able to prevent and detect corruption. It's not, because you can't control human behavior. But if you build a culture of ethics and compliance and anti-corruption, if you engage your employees, if you train them properly, if you, is that you use the carrot. How are you compensating your senior managers? How are you compensating your business development people? Is there metrics that is also embedding ethical behavior, not just meeting numbers? How are you meeting the numbers? So all these are lessons learned, because if you look at the Ethisphere annual report on the most ethical companies, the empirical data shows that if you're an ethical company, you will perform as well or better than unethical companies. So being ethical is a good business practice. You're actually competitive. It is a competitive business advantage. So having compliance is listening and understanding where you are, what is your risk profile, how are you implementing on this? But it's also asking a question of your people, because if in your certain countries where it is not if you're going to be asked for a bribe, it's when. So how are you habilitating those people to manage that reality? What tools are you providing them? You know, is it an ethical line? Are you providing them the right measures, the right tools, the right reporting lines? Because the pressure is there for them to perform. But if you just give them, policy, that's nothing. That's worthless if you don't give them the tool. If they don't feel engaged and secure in saying no, in countering those pressures. So it is a really a holistic view, but it's practical as well. What are the practical lessons? How are you applying those lessons? And how are you testing them? Because ultimately, it is you're accountable not just to regulators, because the chances of getting investigated is much less than having a scandal on front news that is actually triggered by your employees saying, hey, something happened here. this is bad. And then the regulator and the enforcement agencies are going to go after you. So the reputational risk today in the business environment, the evolution that we have, you must not just have a compliance program in place and ethics and compliance in place, you need to demonstrate that it's working, not just to regulators, but to your own people, to your and your partners. Because it's not just you and your corporation, it's who you're dealing with. Because you're now the supply chain, your business partners, if they're acting unethically, you will pay a price to it. So you can no longer sit on your hand and saying, oh, you know, it's not my responsibility. They're my agents, and it's not me, it's not my company. Actually, no, you are responsible for their activity and their action. So you need to be proactive today. You can't just be reactive. And those are the lessons that are learned, because the cost now in terms of a penalty, disgorgement, your reputational risk, you can destroy it in 30 seconds because social media, it'll take years to repair. So you can't afford to ignore this anymore.
Thanks,
I'll
Pat.
let others comment.
Thanks, Pat. Sylvia, I wanted to address a question to you, and you can, and I think with that question, you can provide some comments on what Pat is saying, because I think we have a theme now on culture and the importance of culture, and it all started like all of these started when FCPA and other anti-corruption legislation started making an impact on the business world. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the impact of the FCPA on local markets, and what is your view on the requirements from a local perspective? Do you see an impact that is being made?
Yeah, from my experience, I can say that we have two groups of organizations related to FCPA in the markets where I operate. And thankfully, the first group consists of organizations that do business with multinational companies from the United States or international companies whose shares are listed on the US stock exchanges. But what is specific about those groups is that they conduct their business almost exclusively abroad. And what is also specific, what is also specific in doing their business, they perhaps maybe just up to 20% of their revenue generated just on the local market. And the good things is that they have a strong desire to comply with FCPA requirements, even though they are mostly SMEs and they don't have resources to build robust compliance program. But also I have noticed that they care very much about doing business in accordance with the FCPA requirements, and even apply these practices, including due diligence where appropriate, with their suppliers and sub-suppliers, because they don't want to lose their contract with multinational companies due to some irregularities or corruption on the local market, or maybe some corrupt actions on their suppliers' part. And one thing I would particularly like to point out about these organizations is that they really invest a lot in the development of organizational culture, and they tend to build ethical organizational culture and culture of integrity. And in those companies, integrity can very well be felt at the top. And when you talk with the owners or members of the governing body, they no longer accept old or local way of doing business, because they know that without integrity, they cannot build the trust that is very important in doing business internationally. But what is also specific in those organizations, as they told me in our conversations, majority of them do not apply anymore to public procurement tenders, because they know that there some others rules are applied there, and they apply for tenders only in situation where state-owned companies is looking for the service that they can only offer because they are unique. But we also have the second group of organizations. They are also consist of suppliers and distributors of multinational companies, but which operate in the local markets. And they must comply with the requirements of the FCPA, but at the same time play by the rules of the local market. And I can say that those group is very vulnerable, especially those which operate in industries and sectors that are considering high risk, like public works and construction, utilities, oil and gas, mining, power generation and transmission, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, etc. And some of them are really torn between multinational companies and the requirements of FCPA and the local way of doing business, where it is very difficult to do business without giving bribes. And having talked to some local distributors, they told me that multinational companies were forcing them to comply with FCPA on one hand, but also pressuring them in achieving financial results in those corrupted sectors. But we have to know that in those sectors, the unwritten rule is bribe or go away. And if you don't want to grease someone's palm, as I already mentioned, there are 10 others waiting to take your place and push you out of the market. And unfortunately, I can say that all those local organizations have anti-corruption policy on paper, but due to local situational factor, majority of them, in fact, only pretend to live by them. And due to those very reasons, many are guided by the rule that we call the 11th commandment, and it goes like this: everything is fine as long as you don't get caught. And at the end, I just want to conclude, according to FCPA, multinational companies cannot control local distributors, but they are responsible for their business. And they have to make the strategic decision about how they want to do business in a local corrupted market and how important their reputation is in the relation to their financial results.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. I have one question that I wanted to ask to Ervlin very quickly, and in the interest of time, after that question, we'll move on to the questions that are from the audience. Ervlin, in the spirit of what Sylvia was saying, from your perspective in East and Southeast Asia, what are common FCPA risks that business leaders need to know when working with local partners?
I think Pat made a great point on the unprecedented global collaboration in reining in corruption. And that alone, I believe, is worth celebrating. At the same time, though, we need to also see that financial criminals have also formed a global alliance, which increases the risk of frauds. An example for both is the 1MDB multi-billion-dollar scandal that involved entities and individuals from at least 10 jurisdictions across Asia Pacific, Middle East, Europe, and America. And when the implementation of FCPA and other anti-bribery laws is getting more and more rigorous, brazen forms of corruption have given way to subtle forms of bribery. If 10 years ago, people would bribe government officials in cash, in a large number of cash, today, most bribes come in disguise as loans, as donations, or as seemingly legitimate income that has been routed through multiple jurisdictions, especially offshore. So it becomes even more important today for business leaders to see a bigger picture of what they've been involved in locally in order to detect those tricks to circumvent FCPA. Say, for example, if you are signing a partnership with a subsidiary of a corporate group, make sure that you keep an eye on the whole group rather than just that one single subsidiary you are dealing with. Because it is a common business practice for owners to have some companies operating under the group play the role of clean and compliant partners and have other companies operating under the group handle all those dirty tricks undercover. So if you're just looking at that one single subsidiary, chances are you'll find a perfect partner in the beginning and then only detect or discover problems later on, halfway through the partnerships when things could have been too late. This is like kind of a division of labor from the business partner, or like a movie director casting some actors as protagonists and other actors as antagonists. This is very common way that business owners here in Asia Pacific is dealing when they're dealing with their subsidiaries. Some play the clean part, others do the dirty work. Another thing worth flagging up here, I believe, is the prevalence of fake news or fake information here in the Asia Pacific region. It's very common. It's a habit of the multinationals to run due diligence investigation before deals. in the past 7 years or so, my colleagues and I have been working with dozens of professionals here across jurisdictions in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. And I'm sorry to say that we broke up with a lot of them as we found them making up stories for due diligence reports. I'm sorry to say this. So business leaders, if you don't speak local language, if you are not really aware of the local culture and you rely heavily on your vendors and getting information, get some referral, and be very careful in selecting the vendors. Last but not least is the importance of leadership. I guess I remember that Pat has been elaborating on that point, so I guess to save time, I'll skip that. Over to you, Ralph.
That's the perfect tie-in to one question that we had from the audience, and I think it's a very interesting question. So this question is addressed to any and all of the panelists. So how can we practically prepare the leadership cadre to actively be culture change catalysts in the fight against corruption? And part two of that question is corruption on the climate change agenda.
One thing I think it's important is to make sure that leadership has accountability and in some cases criminal and civil liability, right? Nothing motivates somebody than realizing they too could be in the crosshairs. And this thing called willful blindness under the FCPA, just because you don't want to know what's happening, but you still are demanding success in regions, there's still accountability under the law for people like yourselves who have their head in the sand, so to speak. And so I think number one is education, like letting them know, letting leadership know that just because the problem is existing 10,000 miles away with a third-party vendor, that they're not responsible for that. I think you want to remind them. Obviously, you want to empower through inspiration, not just through sticks. You do need some carrots in there. Like, this is the theme, this is perfect. But I think also I'm mentioning, I think Pat did, about bonuses tied to their incentives for their comp packages is another way, but ultimately educating them and showing them case examples of leadership doing great things and leadership doing things that are not so great and getting them in trouble. And then lastly, I think one thing that's always important is that during meetings, all hands meetings with the company, either annually or whatever, quarterly, if you can talk about examples and maybe anonymously about people standing up and seeing something that's not right, seeing something, saying something, and then seeing the company pivot and respond appropriately to that action or that concern, that people's voices matter and that whistleblowers are valued in a company. I think all of that education in briefing up the board, briefing up leadership on these things, I think is an important first step when you think about these things.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and I would add here that cultural intelligence is critical at all levels. And when I talk about cultural intelligence, is doing the homework that when you go into the country, what are the contexts that you're going into? You don't go in blindly, and that you are partnering with the right people to have the right context, not tainted or fake, as everyone mentioned and Sylvia. It's important to take the time, because if you're going to high risk jurisdiction, you need to do your due diligence at a high risk level and to do the homework, because doing the preparation, the planning will save you so much time, aggravation, time, money, and scandals if you do your homework beforehand. But you need to create this environment where at the top level is having not just a cultural thing, but the competency. Who at the board level has the competency, the experience to ask the right question to ensure that things are working right, that you have accountability, you have the testing, you have the audits, but if you don't have the competent knowledge at the senior level, they don't know what questions to ask of the leadership. And then thirdly is, tone at the top is important, but I refer to tone at the top, action to the middle, and engagement at the bottom, because everybody needs to be involved in that process. It's not just tone at the top. Your clerk, everybody needs to be trained and to have accountability so that they can rise up the information or the red flags that they identified. because if they don't have the capacity, the knowledge, the training to identify the red flags, this is where scandals and explosions come in. So you need to engage every level of your team, but where it's missing is at the middle. You know, action from middle, because you can have the tone at the top, but if the middle managers are not trained, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the training, they don't have the tools to facilitate that engagement, then it's not going to work. Because in when you have whistleblowing line, it's great, but usually people want to rely on their middle managers. They want to trust their middle managers. They will report to middle managers, but those middle managers need to have the tools, the competency to be able to upscale it and bring it up to senior managers.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, Pat. We still have 10 minutes left and a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll try to get them in as much as possible. So a question to the panelists: what tools would be needed on top of anti-corruption compliance for enforcement at the state level? Sorry?
Can you ask the question again?
Sure, of course. So what tools would be needed on top of anti-corruption compliance for enforcement at the state level? So talking about government officials and how can we, on top of controls from a compliance perspective, how can we make sure that at the state level we properly enforce anti-corruption?
If I can just start very quickly, for me, with the state level, is about transparency and accountability in the procurement process, because this is where the touch points with a lot of corporation multinationals is at the procurement level with touch points with public officials. So it's having greater accountability, transparency, and reportability of what the process is and how these contracts are actually provided, so that there's more clarity and confidence into the process. I mean, there's no magic solutions out there, but the more accountability, transparency, and the use of technology today, because if you can eliminate some touch points, if you can bring in technology in terms of eliminating, and there's some great practices where you remove the names of the corporations and you just have, you know, the evaluation of the proposals without knowing who the company is, then you eliminate some of the, you know, some touch points where corruption can occur. So there's multiple levels, but for me, it is about greater transparency, accountability, and reportability, so that the public knows what is happening as well.
Agreed. Yes, Evelyn.
I believe that compared to tools, people is more important. So at the state level, choose the right people. Skills can be trained, but the inherent qualities in people cannot be trained. If let's say a senior government official is wrongly chosen, you choose a corrupt one which is not ethical, then he or she is gonna, you know, enlarge his team, expand his team with the same, you know, people with the same quality. So when we're talking about tools, yes, tools are important, and Pat has talked a lot about that, but what's more important than tool is to set up a system which can help us to choose the right person to sit at the top.
Absolutely agreed. I absolutely agree, and I think this is something that is very much understated. This should be given much more importance, I think. So another question that we have from the audience: has the pandemic affected the anti-corruption fight, and how?
One thing I'll just mention around that topic is, number one, one of the issues with the pandemic is that companies rather, have been finding ways to add resiliency to their supply chain. And in doing so, they've brought on a lot more third parties, right? Think about all of the people and companies that are needed for every little piece that fits into that widget, and then having second, third, fourth examples of backups in your supply chain. And so what's happening is, you're in this pandemic, you're bring on all these third parties. And on top of that, you're having the inability to do the type of diligence you've wanted to do in the past. And so what you've done is you've really upped your risk, right? Because now you have more third parties you don't know about, and that you're depending on them in critical areas because the business is saying, look, no matter what, the widget's got to get built. We don't really care so much about where the ingredients of that widget are coming from. It's a bottom line issue. We don't worry about the cost center, right? Typical things we see. And so my concern is that these are turning into long-term relationships and that no one goes back retroactively to look and do the correct diligence that's required. And then in a couple of years, the pandemic hopefully, thankfully goes away or is greatly diminished, but yet we really have these risky third parties that we're relying on, we really don't know anything about. That problem will compound and will create massive issues for your organization. So that's one area I think is really quite important.
If I can just add a point to that, is your supply chain, the list of suppliers that you've had pre-COVID, you have to review the entire list. Why? Because every single supplier has gone through a major disruptive cycle where the COVID has turned many companies into survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, your compliance measures go out the window because you're just trying to survive. So the risk accrues because of that. So post-COVID, what you need is that even if you've had a relationship for 10, 20 years with the same supplier and they've been good, you need to ask the question, how has COVID affected you? Because have you dismantled, ignored your own compliance measures that put you at risk, that put me at risk now? So there needs to be a review of the entire process because you're no longer dealing with the same entity that you dealt pre-COVID. It's a reality. I mean, yes, you can't do this overnight, but you need to be aware that the risk has increased because of it.
Thanks, Pat. And speaking of the supply chain and suppliers, we have a question from the audience. What are the penalties or fines, or generally speaking, what are the consequences for those who make counterfeit parts to disrupt the supply chain process of a company?
I would just argue that, go on, Ralph.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I would think that the penalties or fines would be similar to a company that has committed fraud or corruption. Although I think it could be much more detrimental because, for example, if it's let's say a company that makes parts for an airplane or a car, and if they're counterfeit and they don't pass the quality requirements, then it could be something that is very dangerous.
I think it's also important, just in general terms, that government enforcement, whether it's in the United States or other parts of the world, you're not going to get a pass because the conduct occurred during the pandemic. The requirements have not changed. Lots of public statements have been made that that nothing has changed from an enforcement standpoint, and so don't think you're going to get a pass because, look, I was just trying to keep the company alive. You understand, as a pandemic, it was very hard to do the diligence. What could we have done? That's not going to put you in a position of success with regulatory bodies around the world. So I think that's important, just to put it out there.
Quality assurance has not changed because of the pandemic. I mean, it's still there, especially in areas of public safety or security. That hasn't changed. I mean, if you play Russian roulette or if you play the dice because you got COVID, it's on you. And your reputation, your business is going to go down the drain because, yeah, you tried to survive, and I understand the pressure was there. But if you cut the corners to the quality of your product, your services, you're going to pay a higher price because as we go through this, you're going to be discovered, and then your pressure is now, you're done. You're done because of social media. Look at all the fraudsters and their reputation being tarnished and crucified. There's no excuse. The public itself at large does not excuse this type of behavior. So your consumers, your partners are going to look at you and says, I don't want to deal with you. Forget this, because you're cheating, you're a liar, and now you're putting people at risk. Forget this.
Yeah. And if I may add, I think it's in times of crisis where ethics and values really come into play.
Yes, it's
You
that
don't
much
judge,
more important.
exactly. You don't judge a person or a company by their actions during normal times. They should be more judged during the times of crisis, for sure.
Yeah, look at ESG today. ESG is becoming ubiquitous, and corruption, governance, ethics, environment, it's all important now. And if you're not in the bandwagon, you're going to be off on in the dark ages somewhere, and you'll be lost in the forest because people are not going to want to deal with you.
Right. I think, well, did anybody else have anything to say? I think we're now at our time limit. Any final thoughts? If not, I just wanted to, on behalf of PECB, thank everyone for attending. I want to thank you to all of the panelists for your amazing insights on this topic, and thanks PECB for organizing this conference. It's always a pleasure to take part in it.
It was a pleasure to share the stage with these great people.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.